What I want to accomplish with this is give you basically an overview of the organizations that are out there, what kinds of organizations are out there, what kinds of things they're doing, why they're doing these things, where they get the money for doing them, some of the methods in terms of how they go about doing it. It's going to be more focused to a certain extent on, especially when we go to the history of the United States and the organization of the United States working outside of the United States, but I'll also make sure I throw in and address, and you'll see some of them, some organizations primarily from Europe as well and some other places. So that's what I hope to accomplish in terms of what I spit out here. And then, you know, let's just kind of make it work in terms of what your questions are and what your burning issues are. So first, types of organizations, I would say there are basically 3 different types of sectors plus the individual. So let's go through those. First, the government, right? The government is involved in delivering social services, whether it's here in the United States, whether it's outside of the United States, right? What are some of the examples here in the United States of the government being involved in delivering social services? Welfare to work, right? Same thing outside of here, right? What about some of the other countries? How's the government involved in providing social services? Anybody know? It doesn't have to be somebody outside of the country. Anything you've heard?
Disaster relief.
Disaster relief. It could be medical care. Yep. Refugee services, right? So different governments have different government institutions that are fully involved, right, in providing social services. Where does their funding come from to do that? From what? Taxpayers, right? They have kind of an automatic stream of funding. It's just a budget, whatever budget they can get right through their own budgetary process. But they usually don't have to apply for funding. They have to justify, right, what they spend. Okay, so, and the government, of course, yeah, different levels of government, same thing in other countries, municipal, state, federal, bilateral, multilateral, you know, it goes all the way up and down, things. When you're talking about governments providing international services, then you're primarily talking at the federal level. So the United States, for example, has the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is in charge of administering the United States Foreign Assistance Program, right? So they either fund or they actually sometimes implement. In Britain, for example, it's called the Department for International Development, DFID. Denmark, it's DANIDA. I forget what it stands for. But each country has their own department, like the U.S. Agency for International Development. Now, at the government level, you also have what are called bilateral organizations. Those are the ones that I just mentioned. Why bilateral? Why would they be called bilateral organizations? Anybody know? Bilateral basically because it's government to government. Nothing else in between. So the U.S. Agency for International Development will be dealing directly with other governments. Okay? If it's multilateral, what's an example of a multilateral institution? Hi, baby. Come on in. Have a seat. United Nations. Multilateral means many governments involved at the same time. Another example of a multilateral institution. Anybody think of one? United Nations? I'm sorry? Red Cross is, although it has affiliates. So in a sense it is, and again, multilateral is referring to government, and Red Cross is not quite government, even though it has relationships with government. The World Bank, for example, would be another one, if you've heard of the World Bank. That would be another. So the United Nations, World Bank, those would be 2 examples of multilateral organizations. All right, let's go to the nonprofit sector. This you know all about. What is the nonprofit sector? It's also known as a voluntary sector, as a philanthropic sector, as the charitable sector. What is a nonprofit sector? Why is it called nonprofit or voluntary or philanthropic or charitable?
They don't pay taxes.
Okay, they don't pay taxes. Well, here in the United States, they don't pay taxes. You're right. They're tax exempt. Yep. What else? What are some of the other characteristics of the nonprofit sector? I'm sorry? Right. So usually they don't actually make a profit, although more and more nonprofit organizations actually have for-profit businesses that they use to raise funds to then administer social services. That's a fairly recent trend, right? But the nonprofit sector is one that's not in it for a business, right? And the nonprofit sector is one that here in the United States is huge. Anybody know? I just looked up some quick numbers before I came. About $46 billion. About 1.7 million employees. I mean, it's huge. Yeah. I'm sorry? So United Way, you know, the organizations you're involved with that you mentioned are all nonprofit, right? They're all kind of the social service organizations. Same thing outside of the United States, right? There are nonprofit sectors in all the different countries. And those nonprofit sectors, including in developing countries like Guatemala, where you all are going, have absolutely flourished from about the 1980s. Any idea why in the 1980s they began to grow? And we'll look a little bit more of this in history. Why such an explosion beginning in the 1980s? Just hazard a guess if you don't know.
Technology.
Technology might be one, not quite as much though in this case. They have been making more and more use of it though. Democracy is one. That's very good. So in Eastern Europe, for example, there was no nonprofit sector, voluntary sector before because it was seen as a challenge. Same thing in Cuba right now, right? The nonprofit sector has to be very, very careful what they do. What else? So that's a good one. Anything else? Funding. With this sector, always remember that funding is key. As you know from your own programs, you're always looking for where you can get funds. In the 1980s, there's a huge shift for the bilateral organizations, the government organizations. Instead of just working with other governments, they decided that wasn't working well because of corruption, because of inefficiency. They thought that the nonprofit sector was much more efficient, so they started plowing a lot of funding, and it just blossomed. It just exploded. The number of organizations and the number of money that went there. Good. You can see these different labels for different kinds of organizations with a nonprofit. Grassroots, you've probably heard of that. Right, grassroots, more working directly with the community or organizations of the community themselves. NGOs, non-governmental organizations, kind of everybody. INGOs, international non-government organizations. GO-NGOs, so you have NGOs, INGOs, GONGOs, government, non-governmental organizations. I mean, it becomes an alphabet soup, as you all know from your experience. And CSOs, civil society organizations. That term civil society many times is also applied to kind of that nonprofit sector. Okay? Private sector. What are some examples of the private sector being involved in delivering social services? Any idea? You can look again in your own experience in the United States or outside. Anybody think of it? Private sector delivering social services?
Like Independence Foundation or like organizations that have an endowment?
Could be, although those still are considered part of the nonprofit sector because they're foundations, again, right, they're not in it for the profit. But more and more, and especially this has been more late 90s and then at the turn of this last century, is the government actually puts out bids for those who want to deliver social services. So people actually are in it for profit. So they're actually called for-profit service contractors or service contractors. And again, this is huge in international development. Think about how much has been privatized. Look at the war in Iraq. Right, with Blackwater and all that, actually military functions are being outsourced as well to the private sector. Same thing with the social sector, especially under this current administration, starting with President Reagan. There was a belief that the private sector could do things better and more efficiently, so a lot of the social services that had been carried out either by government or the money that had been plowed into the nonprofit sector, more and more was put out for bids. So you have for-profit organizations out there doing human rights work, doing community development, doing health work, whatever it might be. So it's education is a perfect example, right? With all the, I forget what the main one is in Chester. I know that was handed over in Philadelphia, I think. Yep. EMOs, right? Absolutely. So that's a perfect example of things that have been privatized. So it's important to keep that in mind. And then finally, of course, you can't discount individuals, right? Even though they're not a type of organization, but you know that things get started when individuals have a passion for it. They quickly develop their own organizations and get into it that way. Okay? Any questions so far? That's just a brief overview of the kinds of organizations that are out there. Now, these kinds are very important to keep in mind because generally they face different pressures. Even though they may be working in the same areas, they have different constraints, they have different motivations, they have different methods. Not always, right? I mean, you can't generalize too much, but there are some patterns there that we'll take a look at.